Have you ever watched the person you love most in this world slowly disappear right before your eyes? Not all at once, not in some dramatic collapse, but quietly, piece by piece, day after day, until one morning you realize the light in their eyes is almost gone. This is the story of a little girl who refused to let that happen. In a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the far edge of the city, where the rent was always late and the walls were thin enough to hear the neighbors arguing, lived Marigold Thompson and her 7-year-old daughter, Nova. Marigold was 32, though most days she felt twice that age. She worked at Blake's Artisanal Footwear, an elegant little store that sold handmade leather shoes for prices that could have paid their rent for 3 months. She stood on those polished floors from 8 in the morning until 6 at night. Sometimes longer, smiling through the fire in her lower back and the raw blisters on her feet. Every single morning at 5:15, her eyes opened before the alarm. She would lie there for 30 seconds, just 30 seconds, staring at the water stain on the ceiling and wondering how much longer she could keep doing this. Then she would swing her legs over the side of the bed, bite back a groan, and begin again. Nova slept beside her, small body curled into the only safe place she knew. Even in sleep, her tiny hand reached for her mother's. Marigold would gently untangle their fingers, kiss her daughter's forehead, and whisper the same words she had whispered every morning for years. Just one more day, baby. Mommy's got you. The coffee maker in the kitchenette was older than Nova. It gurgled and hissed like it was complaining. But it still worked. Marigold drank it black. Cream and sugar were luxuries that lived in other people's kitchens. She stood at the counter while it brewed, flipping through the stack of bills that never seemed to get smaller. Rent, electricity, Nova's school supplies, the medical bill from the time Nova had that terrible ear infection last winter. The numbers blurred together until they all looked the same, impossible. By 6:30 Nova was awake, rubbing sleep from her eyes with the back of her hand. Mommy, do you have to go to the store again today? Marigold turned with the brightest smile she could manage. Of course I do, sweetheart. Somebody's got to keep the lights on and make sure my favorite girl has cereal in the morning. Nova climbed onto the stool at the counter, watching her mother move. You look tired, Mommy. I'm fine, baby, just a little sleepy. You know how Mommy gets when she stays up late working on those pretty bags for Mrs. Ramirez. Nova didn't answer. She just kept watching. The morning routine was a dance they both knew by heart. Marigold helped Nova into her favorite purple sweater, packed a peanut butter sandwich and an apple in a brown paper bag, and walked her to the bus stop 3 blocks away. The air was still cool in late spring, and Marigold pulled her thin coat tighter around her body. Be good today, my love, she said, kneeling down so they were eye to eye. Learn something wonderful, and remember how much I love you. Nova threw her arms around her mother's neck and held on longer than usual. I love you more, Mommy. Please rest a little today if you can. Marigold's throat tightened. She kissed the top of her daughter's head and forced a laugh. I'll try my very best. But they both knew she wouldn't. She couldn't. Rest was a word that belonged to people who had savings accounts and supportive families and time. Marigold had none of those things. At Blake's, the day unfolded exactly as it always did. The store smelled of rich leather and polished wood and money. Customers glided in and out, trying on shoes that cost more than Marigold earned in a week. She smiled. She recommended. She carried heavy boxes from the back room until her arms shook. Mr. Blake, Rowan Blake, the owner, walked through twice that day, nodding at the staff like a general inspecting troops. Efficiency. People, he reminded them in his crisp voice. Luxury customers do not wait. By noon Marigold's lower back was screaming. By 3 o'clock her hands were bleeding again from the rough edges of the shoeboxes and the quick sewing repairs they sometimes asked her to do for important clients. She wrapped her fingers in paper towels from the staff bathroom and kept working. When she finally clocked out at 6, her body felt like it belonged to someone else. She picked Nova up from Mrs. Ramirez's apartment next door, made a quick dinner of boxed pasta and jarred sauce, helped with spelling homework, and read 2 chapters of Charlotte's Web even though her eyes kept closing. At 8:47 she tucked Nova into bed. kissed both cheeks, and turned off the light. Only then did the second shift begin. Marigold pulled the old sewing machine out from under the bed. Tonight she was altering 2 dresses for the lady down the hall and finishing a small tote bag she hoped to sell online for $20. $20 that would help with groceries. $20 that might keep the lights on 1 more week. The needle moved up and down. Up and down. Her bandaged fingers protested. The lamp cast long shadows across the wall. By midnight the bleeding had started again. She paused just long enough to wrap fresh strips of cloth around her fingers. Then kept sewing. At 1:47 in the morning she finally stopped. Her vision was swimming. She turned off the lamp, crawled into bed beside her daughter, and let the tears come. Silent ones. The kind she had learned to cry without sound so she wouldn't wake Nova. She thought no one heard her. But Nova heard everything. The little girl lay perfectly still, eyes open in the dark, listening to her mother's quiet sobs and feeling every tremble that ran through the mattress. Nova had been watching for weeks now. She saw the way her mother's shoulders hunched when she thought no one was looking. She saw the way she sometimes had to use both hands to stand up from the couch. She saw the empty look in her eyes when the bills arrived. And Nova had made a decision. The next morning was Saturday. Marigold still had to work a full shift. While her mother was in the shower, Nova went to the old cookie tin she kept under her bed, her piggy bank. She counted carefully. 3 $1 bills, crumpled and soft from being held too many times. It was everything she had. She tucked the money into the pocket of her pink jacket, put on her sneakers, and waited by the door. When Marigold kissed her goodbye at 7:45, Nova looked up at her with those big, serious eyes. "Have a good day at work. Mommy, I love you so much. I love you more than all the stars. Baby, be good for Mrs. Ramirez." As soon as the door closed, Nova counted to 100. Then she slipped out, closed the door quietly behind her, and began walking the 6 blocks to Blake's Artisanal Footwear. She didn't know exactly what she was going to say. She only knew one thing for certain. Her mommy was disappearing. And Nova was the only one who could stop it. The sidewalk felt endless beneath Nova's small sneakers, each step carrying her closer to a moment she had imagined 100 times in the dark of her bedroom. The morning sun was gentle, but her heart pounded like a drum inside her chest. She kept one hand in her pocket, fingers curled tightly around the 3 crumpled $1 bills. They felt so small, so ordinary, yet they were everything she had to offer the most powerful man she had ever heard her mother speak of with quiet fear. She rehearsed the words again and again, whispering them under her breath so no one on the street would think she was strange. "Please let my mommy rest. Just one day. She hurts so much, her back. Her hands, she doesn't sleep. Please." Blake's Artisanal Footwear rose ahead of her like a palace made of glass and polished wood. Through the tall windows she could see the beautiful shoes arranged like jewels, deep burgundy, soft caramel, midnight black, shoes her mother helped sell every single day, shoes that cost more than the rent they could barely afford. Nova hesitated at the door. Her reflection in the glass looked tiny and frightened. What if they laughed at her? What if Mr. Blake was as cold as the stories her mother never quite finished telling? What if this was the biggest mistake of her short life? Then she thought of the night before, of her mother's quiet sobs in the dark. Of the way her shoulders shook when she thought no one could see. Of the way she sometimes pressed her hand to her lower back and winced so hard her eyes closed. Nova pushed the heavy door open. The chime above her head rang like a little bell. But no one turned. The store was alive with movement, well-dressed customers sliding their feet into luxury. Sales associates smiling with practiced warmth. The soft scent of leather and wealth floating in the air. Nova kept her head down and moved quickly, remembering the way her mother had once led her through a side door marked "Employees Only" when she'd needed to grab something from the back. She waited until a tall man in a suit distracted the nearest associate with questions about sizing, then slipped through the door like a shadow. The stockroom was cooler, quieter, and smelled strongly of cardboard and new leather. Towering metal shelves stretched into the distance, stacked with boxes that probably held more money than Nova had ever seen. Voices echoed from deeper inside, low. Serious. The kind of voices that made decisions about other people's lives. She crept closer, hiding behind a tall stack of boxes, and peeked around the corner. There he was. Rowan Blake stood with his arms crossed, sharp jaw tight, tailored suit somehow making him look even taller and more untouchable. His voice was calm but carried an edge that made the other man, a manager in a red tie, stand straighter. 12% growth is acceptable, but not exceptional. We don't reward average here. Efficiency above all. If someone can't keep up, we find someone who can. Nova's stomach twisted. That was her mother they were talking about. Her mother who never stopped moving, who never complained out loud, who came home every night with bleeding fingers and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She couldn't wait another second. Nova stepped out from behind the boxes, her pink jacket suddenly feeling too bright, too childish in this serious place. Mr. Blake? Both men turned. The manager's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Rowan's expression darkened instantly, irritation flashing across his face like lightning. Who are you? He demanded. This area is strictly off limits. How did you even get back here? Nova's voice came out smaller than she wanted. But she didn't run. She held out her hand, the 3 crumpled dollars trembling slightly in her palm. My name is Nova Thompson. My mommy works here. Her name is Marigold. She sells the shoes and sometimes sews the special ones at night. Please, sir, can you let her rest? Just one day? Rowan blinked, clearly thrown off by the sight of a 7-year-old in his stockroom. Your mother let you come here alone? This is completely unacceptable. You need to leave right now before I. She doesn't know I'm here, Nova said quickly, the words tumbling out before her courage could disappear. She's working right now, trying so hard. She thinks I'm next door with Mrs. Ramirez. But I had to come. She hurts all the time. Mr. Blake. Her back hurts so bad she can't stand up straight some nights. Her hands bleed from the sewing and the boxes. She stays up until 2 or 3 in the morning making extra money so we don't lose our apartment. She doesn't sleep. She barely eats. And I'm scared. I'm really scared that if she keeps going like this, one day she just won't come home. She'll disappear. The stockroom fell silent except for the distant hum of the store's music. Nova kept going, her voice cracking but steady. I brought this. It's all I have. $3. It's not much, but it's yours if you'll just let her rest tomorrow. Please. She loves me more than anything. And I love her. And I don't want her to disappear. She's the best mommy in the whole world. Rowan stared at the small girl, at the 3 crumpled bills, at the fierce, desperate hope in her big brown eyes. For a long moment he said nothing. The irritation was still there, he could feel it simmering, but something else had cracked through it. A memory he hadn't allowed himself to touch in years. His own mother, a seamstress who had worked herself into an early grave, always saying she was fine, always saying one more day wouldn't kill her. He pushed the memory down hard. This is a serious breach of protocol, he said, his voice colder than he intended. Children do not belong in the stockroom. Your mother will be spoken to about this. And you. Please, Nova whispered. One tear finally escaped and slid down her cheek. Just one day. She needs it. She's so tired. Rowan looked at the $3 still held out in that tiny hand. He looked at the child who had somehow found the courage to walk into his world and ask for the one thing he had never given his own employees, mercy. Something inside him shifted. Not completely. Not yet. But enough. He exhaled slowly and rubbed the bridge of his nose. Fine. One day. Paid. Tell your mother she has tomorrow off. But this never happens again. And you, he pointed a finger at her. Not unkindly, never come back here like this. It's dangerous and against every rule we have. Do you understand? Nova's face broke into the brightest, most radiant smile Rowan had seen in years. The relief and pure joy in it hit him harder than any quarterly report. Thank you so much, Mr. Blake. Mommy is going to be so happy. She can sleep in. She can rest. She can just be for one whole day. Thank you. She turned and ran. The $3 still clutched in her fist because she couldn't bear to leave them behind now that they had done their job. The chime of the front door rang once more as she disappeared back into the morning sunlight. Rowan watched her go, the stockroom suddenly feeling too quiet. The manager beside him cleared his throat awkwardly. Should I have security review the cameras? That was a major security breach. Rowan didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on the door where the little girl had vanished. No, he said at last. Leave it, and pull Marigold Thompson's file. I want to know exactly how long she's been with us, and how much she's been carrying. He turned back to the shelves. But the numbers in his head didn't line up the way they usually did. The child's voice kept echoing. Will she disappear? For the first time in a very long time, Rowan Blake felt something he had no spreadsheet for, unease. And beneath it, something dangerously close to guilt. Nova burst through the apartment door like a ray of sunlight cutting through storm clouds. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes sparkling in a way Marigold hadn't seen in months. She skidded to a stop in the middle of the tiny living room, clutching something tightly in her fist. Mommy, guess what happened? Marigold had just stepped out of the shower, her hair still damp, wrapped in the threadbare towel that had seen too many washes. She froze, one hand pressed to her aching lower back. The sight of her daughter's pure, unfiltered joy made something inside her chest tighten with both love and fear. What is it, baby? She asked softly, trying to keep the exhaustion out of her voice. Nova opened her palm. The 3 crumpled dollar bills were still there, slightly more wrinkled from her grip. I went to the store. I talked to Mr. Blake. And he said yes, you get tomorrow off. A whole paid day off. He said it himself. The words hit Marigold like a physical blow. For a second she couldn't breathe. The room tilted slightly. Paid day off? Mr. Blake, the man who measured every minute of every employee's time like it was gold, had granted her a full day. Without her even asking? How did you even? Her voice cracked. She sank onto the edge of the couch, the towel slipping from one shoulder. Nova, sweetheart, you didn't go to the store by yourself, did you? Nova nodded, proud and a little defiant. I had to. You're always so tired, Mommy. Your back hurts and your hands bleed and you cry at night when you think I'm sleeping. I couldn't just watch anymore. Tears spilled down Marigold's cheeks before she could stop them. Not the quiet, exhausted ones she cried alone in the dark. These were different, raw, overwhelmed, terrified. She pulled Nova into her arms and held her so tightly the little girl squeaked. You could have gotten in trouble. Marigold whispered against her daughter's hair. You could have gotten hurt. What if someone had taken you? What if Mr. Blake had called the police? I'm supposed to protect you, not the other way around. But he didn't, Nova said, her voice muffled against her mother's shoulder. He got all quiet and then he said yes. He looked sad, almost, like maybe he understood. Marigold didn't know what to believe. Part of her wanted to march straight to the store and apologize. To beg Mr. Blake not to fire her for her daughter's wild behavior. Another part, the exhausted, bone-deep weary part, wanted to believe it was real. One single day, 24 hours where she didn't have to stand for 10 hours on swollen feet. 24 hours where she didn't have to force a smile while her back screamed. 24 hours where she could just exist. That night, sleep came easier than it had in years. But even in rest, her mind wouldn't stop turning. What if this was a trick? What if tomorrow she showed up and he fired her anyway? What if the day off came with strings, expectations she couldn't meet? Morning arrived soft and golden. Marigold woke before her alarm for the first time in forever. But instead of dread, there was something fragile and new blooming in her chest. Hope, maybe, or at least the absence of immediate panic. She and Nova spent the morning slowly. No rushing, no quick breakfast scarfed down while standing. They made pancakes together, real ones. With the last of the blueberries Marigold had been saving. They ate on the couch, legs tangled, watching cartoons Nova loved. For the first time in months, Marigold laughed without forcing it. By afternoon, the sun was warm enough that Nova begged to go to the little park 3 blocks away. Marigold hesitated, her body still ached. The medical bills still loomed. The fear of losing her job still whispered in the back of her mind. But one look at her daughter's hopeful face and she caved. They spread an old blanket under the biggest oak tree. Nova ran off to chase a butterfly while Marigold sat with her back against the trunk. Eyes half closed, letting the warmth soak into her sore muscles. She hadn't realized how much she needed this. How much she had been running on fumes for so long that simply sitting still felt like luxury. She didn't notice the tall figure watching from the path. Rowan Blake had told himself he was just going for a walk. The park was on his way home. It was coincidence that he happened to take this route today. Coincidence that he spotted the familiar dark hair and the small pink jacket. But the moment he saw Marigold, really saw her, not as an employee but as a person, he couldn't look away. She looked different without the store uniform. Softer, more real, and more exhausted than he had allowed himself to notice before. Even now, sitting in the shade, her shoulders carried tension that sleep and a day off couldn't erase overnight. Her hands rested in her lap. The faint red marks from countless needles and cardboard boxes still visible. Nova spotted him first. She waved excitedly. No fear at all. "Mr. Blake, hi." Marigold's head snapped up. Panic flashed across her face. She started to stand, wincing as her back protested. "Mr. Blake, I'm so sorry about yesterday. Nova shouldn't have." "Don't," he said quietly, stepping closer. His voice lacked its usual edge. "Please, don't apologize." He shrugged off the cashmere vest he wore over his button-down and, without asking, draped it gently over Marigold's shoulders. The fabric was still warm from his body. She stared at him like he'd grown a second head. "You looked cold," he said simply. Then, to Nova, "There's a hot chocolate cart by the entrance. Would you like one?" Nova's eyes went wide. She looked at her mother for permission. Marigold nodded, still speechless. While Nova ran off, Rowan lowered himself onto the blanket beside Marigold. Not too close, not crowding, just there. "I remember my mother," he said after a long moment. Staring at the grass. She was a seamstress, worked in a factory that made uniforms for the military. Long hours, no breaks. She used to come home with her fingers raw and her eyes so tired she could barely see straight. She always said the same thing your daughter said last night, that if she rested, it meant she was replaceable. That she had to keep going or everything would fall apart. His throat tightened. He hadn't spoken about this in decades. "She died when I was 12. Heart gave out. The doctors said it was from years of stress and overwork. I watched her work herself to death and I told myself I would never let that happen to anyone who worked for me. But somewhere along the way, I forgot. I became exactly the kind of man who would have fired her without a second thought." Marigold's eyes filled with tears again. She clutched the edges of his vest like it was armor. "I'm not going to fire you," Rowan said quietly, "and I'm not going to pretend one day off fixes everything. But I want to do better. Starting tomorrow, there will be ergonomic chairs at every station. An espresso machine in the break room. Real breaks, paid ones. And if anyone needs time for their family, they'll get it, no questions." He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time. Marigold saw the man behind the title. The boy who had lost his mother too young. The man who had spent years building walls so high he forgot what it felt like to care. "I can't change what I've done," he said, "but I can change what happens next." Nova returned with 2 steaming cups of cocoa. One for her mother and one for Mr. Rowan, as she had started calling him. She plopped down between them like it was the most natural thing in the world. For the first time in years, the 3 of them sat under the oak tree as the sun dipped lower. And the silence that fell wasn't heavy with exhaustion or fear. It was something else. Something that felt dangerously close to healing. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the city skyline, painting the park in hues of amber and gold. Marigold sat beneath the old oak. Rowan's cashmere vest still draped around her shoulders like an unexpected shield. It smelled faintly of cedar and something else, something steady and quiet. Nova sipped her cocoa happily, swinging her legs and chattering about butterflies and the funny way the steam curled from the cup like tiny dragons. Rowan stayed longer than he intended. He didn't speak much at first. He simply watched the way Nova leaned into her mother's side without hesitation. Watched the way Marigold's fingers unconsciously traced the edge of the vest, as if memorizing its softness. For the first time in years, the numbers and quotas that usually filled his head felt distant, unimportant. I used to come here with my mother, he said suddenly, his voice low, when I was about Nova's age. She'd bring a thermos of tea and a small box of biscuits she'd baked the night before. We'd sit on a bench just over there, he pointed toward a weathered wooden seat near the fountain, and she'd tell me stories about the shoes she was making. Not the factory uniforms, the ones she dreamed of making. Beautiful, impractical things with tiny embroidered flowers and silk linings. She said one day she'd open her own little shop. Marigold turned to look at him. The hard lines of his face had softened in the golden light. What happened to her shop? She never got to open it, Rowan answered. His gaze drifted toward the fountain. But his eyes were seeing something far older. The factory gave her more hours. Then more. She kept saying yes. Said we needed the money for my school books. For the roof that leaked every winter. One morning she didn't wake up. The doctor said her heart simply gave out. She was 39. A quiet fell between them. Nova, sensing the weight, stopped swinging her legs and rested her head against her mother's arm. I'm sorry, Marigold whispered, and she meant it, not just for the loss, but for the way the story echoed her own fears. Rowan nodded once, slowly. I spent the next 20 years making sure no one who worked for me would ever have to say yes to more hours just to survive. Or at least, I thought I was. Somewhere along the way the mission changed. I started measuring success in quarterly reports instead of whether my people went home with enough energy to read their children a bedtime story. He looked at Nova then, and something in his expression cracked open. Your daughter reminded me of the boy I used to be, the one who still believed that resting wasn't weakness. Marigold felt tears sting her eyes again, but they were different this time, cleaner, less heavy. She's braver than I am. No, Rowan said gently. She just loves you more than she's afraid. They sat in companionable silence until the cocoa was gone and the park lights flickered on. When Rowan finally stood, he didn't offer a handshake or a corporate nod. He simply said, take tomorrow too if you need it. I'll handle the schedule. Marigold shook her head, smiling through the tears. One day was already more than I ever expected. I'll be there Monday. But, thank you, for the vest, for the cocoa, for seeing us. Rowan gave a small, almost shy smile, the first real one she had ever seen on him, and walked away into the gathering dusk. The next morning, Marigold arrived at Blake's Artisanal Footwear 15 minutes early, heart fluttering with a strange mix of nerves and something dangerously close to hope. She expected the usual rush of customers, the familiar ache in her feet before she even clocked in. What she found instead stopped her in the doorway. At every sales station stood a sleek, ergonomic chair, deep burgundy leather, adjustable height, the kind of chair that whispered of care rather than cost-cutting. In the break room, where a tired old coffee pot used to sit, gleamed a new espresso machine, complete with a small basket of fresh pastries and a handwritten note in Rowan's precise script. For the people who make this place more than a store. R.B. Marigold's hand flew to her mouth. She walked slowly through the store, touching the back of one chair, then another. Her co-workers were already whispering, smiling, some even laughing in disbelief. One of the older associates, Mrs. Chen, caught her eye and mouthed, "Did you do this?" Marigold shook her head, but her heart was singing. At lunch, she slipped into the break room, brewed herself a real cappuccino for the first time in years, and sat in one of the new chairs with her sketchbook open on her lap. The design that had been living quietly in the back of her mind for months finally spilled onto the page, shoes that didn't just look beautiful, but felt beautiful, wide toe boxes for real feet that stood all day, cushioned insoles that remembered the shape of the wearer, hidden pockets for blister bandages and pain relief patches, elegant enough for boardrooms, kind enough for the women who actually wore them. Nova's words from the park echoed in her mind, "Mommy, you should make shoes that help people like you." By the time her break ended, 3 pages were filled with careful sketches, notes, and even a tiny color palette she'd mixed from the espresso foam and the burgundy leather of the new chairs. When Rowan passed through the sales floor later that afternoon, he paused by her station. Their eyes met across the polished wood. He gave the smallest of nods, barely there. But enough. Marigold smiled back, the kind of smile that reached all the way to her tired bones and told them they could rest a little now. That evening, after Nova was asleep, Marigold sat at the kitchen table with her sketches spread out like stars. For the first time in longer than she could remember, the future didn't feel like a cliff she was hanging from by her fingertips. It felt like a path. And she was finally allowed to walk it. The following Monday, Marigold arrived at the store with her sketchbook tucked under her arm like a secret she could no longer keep. Rowan was already there, standing by the new espresso machine, watching the morning light spill across the polished floors. He didn't ask how she was feeling. He simply nodded toward the break room and said, "Show me what you've been drawing." She hesitated only a moment before spreading the pages across the small table. The designs were unlike anything the store had ever carried, shoes that looked elegant from a distance but revealed their true soul up close, generous toe boxes shaped by real feet. Hidden pockets for comfort aids. Soles that remembered the weight of long days and still offered grace. "I called them the Nova line," she said quietly. "Because they're for women like me. Women who stand so others can sit. Women who deserve shoes that respect the life they live." Rowan studied each sketch in silence, his fingers tracing the lines as if they were something sacred. When he finally looked up, his eyes were bright with something that hadn't been there before, pride. "These aren't just shoes," he said. "They're a revolution in a size 7. Bring them to the board meeting on Friday. I'll make sure you have the floor." Friday arrived with the kind of tension that makes coffee taste like courage. The boardroom smelled of old money and new leather. 5 men and 2 women sat around the long mahogany table, their expressions polite but skeptical as Marigold stood before them in her simple black dress and presented the Nova line. She spoke not of profit margins first, but of the women who would wear them, the single mothers, the nurses, the teachers, the saleswomen who smiled through pain because the world asked them to. She spoke of dignity disguised as design. A few board members shifted uncomfortably. One cleared his throat. "This is admirable, Ms. Thompson, but our brand has always stood for prestige, for aspiration. These shoes sound more like orthopedic wear." Before Marigold could respond, Rowan rose from his seat at the head of the table. The room quieted. "I'd like to tell you a story," he said, his voice steady but carrying the weight of decades. "My mother was a seamstress. She worked herself to death because she believed rest was a luxury she couldn't afford. She died at 39 with calloused hands and an unfinished dream of opening her own shop. I spent years building this company to prove I was nothing like the men who let her break. And somewhere along the way, I became exactly that man." He paused, letting the silence settle like dust in sunlight. "True luxury," he continued, "isn't about making the rich feel richer. It's about making the women who hold the world together feel seen. Marigold's designs don't diminish our brand, they elevate it. They remind us that prestige without compassion is just empty shoes on a shelf." The vote was close, but it passed. 3 weeks later, Marigold Thompson was no longer a sales associate. She was apprentice designer, Nova line, with a small studio space in the back of the store and a salary that finally let her breathe. Her hands, once raw and bandaged, began to heal under the gentle rhythm of creation rather than survival. Nova started coming to the studio after school, sitting on a little stool beside her mother's drafting table, coloring her own shoe designs with crayons while Marigold sketched in ink. Sometimes Rowan would stop by, bringing 2 hot chocolates and staying just long enough to offer quiet encouragement or a story about his mother's unfinished dreams. 6 months later, the first pair of Nova line shoes debuted in the store window, soft chestnut leather with delicate embroidered forget-me-nots along the heel. A hidden arch support that felt like a secret hug. And a tiny tag inside that read, "For the women who carry everything. You deserve to be carried too." The day the first customer bought a pair, Nova was there. She watched the woman slip them on, saw the way her shoulders relaxed, the way she stood a little taller, and whispered to her mother, "She looks like she can finally rest." That evening, as the store closed and the 3 of them, Marigold, Nova and Rowan stood together under the soft glow of the display lights. Nova looked up at the man who had once seemed so tall and untouchable. "Thank you, Mr. Rowan," she said simply, "for making my mommy smile every day." Rowan's eyes glistened. He knelt down so he was eye level with her and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Thank you, Nova, for reminding me what matters most." Then he stood, looked at Marigold with something that had grown quietly between them, trust, respect, and the beginning of something warmer, and said, "The park. This Saturday. All three of us. No work, no designs, just rest. Together." Marigold smiled, the kind of smile that reaches all the way down to the places that used to ache. "We'd like that." And so the little girl who had once walked into a forbidden stockroom with $3 crumpled in her fist had changed everything, not with power, but with love fierce enough to crack open even the hardest heart. The woman who had been disappearing slowly, day by day, was now fully here, creating, laughing, healing, and teaching her daughter that the bravest thing you can do is ask for what the people you love deserve. And the man who had built walls of efficiency around his grief learned that true luxury isn't found in profit sheets or prestige. It's found in the simple, radical act of letting someone rest. And in the courage of a child who refused to watch her mother fade away.